If you're struggling with an endgame narrow ISA individual, you probably want to watch this video. Good morning. Happy Friday. I have Neuro Coffee in hand and it is perfect. That is really good. Already in the midst of a busy Friday, we're going to dive right into the Q&A. And this one actually comes from a mentorship call that we did yesterday. And we were talking about a really difficult scenario that we run into on occasion. And a lot of people will struggle with it. We all do. I do. And it's with those individuals that are narrow ISA presentations, but they're at the end game. And they show some very specific findings, which we'll talk about here in just a second. The reason that there's such difficulty here is because when we're at this end game narrow situation, we have a tremendous amount of concentric orientation that limits the hip mobility to such a degree that it's almost like we really don't have anything available to work with in regards to positioning. And so everything looks like it becomes a compensatory strategy. And so let me show you what we're talking about. We'll grab the pelvis here. So we'll start with our narrow ISA presentation, which is going to look something like that. And remember, plastic model, not perfect, but it'll give us a representation. So we're kind of starting there. We get a lot of concentric orientation in this posterior lower aspect to such a degree that it creates this push from behind, and it sort of orients this ischial tuberosity in line with the femur. And so these external rotation muscles actually start to pull the femur back inward. So it's not just ER. You end up with this presentation that looks like they're externally rotated but adducted at the hip. And so when we talk about common findings, these are the people with the really horrible looking toe touches. And so, they're the people that if they can get below their knees, they're pretty happy. So we have extreme deficits in that. Hip abduction is very limited, so it's often 10-20 degrees of hip abduction. Straight leg raise is very limited as well, therefore hip flexion. And then if you ever check prone hip internal rotation, you're going to see a pretty big deficit there, and you might not have any. And so if we're trying to rely on some activities that we would commonly default to, we just don't even have enough hip flexion to do anything. So what we have to actually do is we have to start with activities where we are sort of oriented with the hip at 0 degrees of traditional hip flexion or extension, depending on your perspective. And so many times we can throw some manual therapies at this and reduce some of that concentric orientation. Maybe that buys us a little bit of hip mobility that we can work with. But if we're going to rely on exercise, sometimes we can maybe put them into a prone situation and do something like that that will give us some of this eccentric orientation that we need in that posterior lower. But it tends to be a challenge. It's almost an exercise in futility in many cases. A lot of times what we have to actually do, if we have to start with some form of hip approximation activity. And so what we're talking about is creating a situation in the back of the pelvis that looks something like this. And so what we're doing is actually we're inducing a very small amount of rotation through the pelvis through hip approximation. And so an activity will look something like that you're seeing on screen right now. And what this starts to do is it starts to actually increase the amount of eccentric orientation in this reciprocal fashion. So we're creating almost like a really tiny variation of the gait cycle through this hip approximation. In many cases, we get really good results from this, and we actually pick up enough hip flexion that we can now start to move people towards some activities like maybe we do some hook lying. We continue to work on yielding and overcoming strategies in this hook lying position, or we can move them into a sideline propulsive activity with an increasing degree of hip flexion, and we can superimpose some reaching on top of that. So you got to remember that you got this iteration that's going on in the thorax at the same time. So if we can superimpose some reaching on top of this propulsive strategy, we get a much bigger bang. One of the activities that's kind of off the beaten path is actually this army crawling that we might want to do. So when we think about the posterior lower compressive strategy that's going to limit the degree of hip flexion in the traditional imaginary sagittal plane. What we can do though is we can deviate the knee laterally and we can go get some extra rotation in that position. So that can actually help us increase the amount of eccentric orientation in this posterior lower strategy as well. So it's probably considered a developmental position for some of you, depending on what your background is, but we want to turn this into an army crawl. This is also a great one for kids with this scenario because they like to crawl around and pretend to be animals. So a little FYI there. If we move to a standing position, what we probably want to do, because we don't have a lot of hip excursion to start with, we're going to start with a very narrow stance chopping activity with a little bit of weight shift. And again, that's going to help us start to capture this little bit of rotation. And again, we're going to sort of move them through a gait cycle. We're going to go from one chop to the other in a reciprocal fashion to recapture this eccentric orientation. Once we start to gain some hip abduction, we gain a little bit of hip rotation back. Now we can move to a bit of a staggered stance chopping activity, and then we can move into like a high-low cable press. One of the things that I like to do at this point is I'll just call it sneaky arm training. So we'll actually have them do biceps and triceps activities, if you will. But what we're going to do is going to be very particular about what stance they're performing these in. And so again, we get to reinforce what we're chasing with this concentric eccentric orientation in the posterior lower aspect while they get to do fun stuff, if you will. As you start to gain hip motion, obviously now we can move into split stance activities. And ultimately what we want to be able to do is move into a deeper side split stance. And this would be indicative of the fact that we've got plenty of eccentric orientation at this point. And then eventually what you may want to be able to do then is move to some form of toe touching, some kind of progression in that manner. And then ultimately that might be what you use as a maintenance strategy. So again, this is a really, really difficult scenario because of the degree of concentric orientation and the compressive strategy that goes on. Take your time, be patient. You have to be very, very patient in these scenarios. But again, work with what you have, work within the constraints, don't force, don't drive compensatory strategies too hard because it just becomes a point of frustration. Hopefully that's useful to you. If it's not, or if I'm incomplete in any way for you, please ask a question at askbillhartman@gmail.com. Everybody have a terrific Friday and an outstanding weekend, and I'll see you next.